The next stitch that I will demonstrate is called the slip stitch. And the slip stitch is somewhat of an invisible stitch. It tends to be used for things when we do not want to see the stitching taking place. So often in construction, we are sewing things from the inside out. So we are putting the right sides of the fabric together, sewing as much as we can by machine, and then flipping it right side out. There are some times that you can't get to everything with a sewing machine. And in many cases, if you're completely sealing up something, say you're making a pillow, for instance, and you're sewing a square or a rectangle, you would sew everything you possibly could except for one section that you would use to turn that item right side out. Then you would finish it off with a slip stitch. So a slip stitch is where the machine can't go. The slip stitch should be very small. You should be very patient with it, but when done well, it's really, really satisfying. It also occasionally can be used for hems when we don't want to have exposed stitches on those hems as well. Okay, so the slip stitch is an always forward moving stitch. So I'm never turning my needle backwards or to the side. I'm always going to be continuing down one line. And again, I like to practice my slip stitch on a fold or pleat because often that's the case. I would sew everything I could except for that hole. I would prep that hole, say it's a hole in a pillowcase, for instance, and I would fold it under and pin it in place before I slip stitch it, much like I have here. So I'm going to insert my needle in the fabric right next to the fold and take a very small stitch forward. Then, where I immediately had come out of the fabric, I'm going to jump across. So I want to make sure I go completely perpendicular to where I've exited, and I'm not moving forward. I'm simply jumping across the way. And I'm going to use the fold that I have here as a little tunnel for my needle to run down. I would really like the thread and the needle to be right on the edge of that fold. I want to keep these stitches small as you can without completely frustrating yourself. I often tell people if you can stick the tip of your pinky finger underneath there and get any movement, then it is too big and it needs to be smaller and closer together. Where I exit here from the fold, I will come right over to the fabric next to it. Again, make a very small stitch. Typically the stitches in the fabric next to the fold are slightly smaller than the fabric or the stitch in the fold. And the way that you can keep it as invisible and incognito as possible is staying as close as you can to that fold and making sure that when you insert your needle, you're going directly across the path and not moving upward at all. So where I've exited, I'm going to come over here to the fold, run my needle right down the edge of the fold. Again, I can't move too far, and pull that flat. I'll do a few more so you can see the motion of that. It can be tricky depending on the fabrics that you're using. Crisper fabrics that iron and pleat well are going to handle this much better than softer fabrics. Softer fabrics can be a little more challenging. Again, prep yourself well. Use pins. Pins are your friend. Also use an iron to get that flat and smoothed out so that gives you less trouble as you're sewing. Also, for demonstration purposes, we're obviously using natural muslin and we're using a contrasting thread. You, in a regular situation, would be using thread that matches your fabric very, very closely. So if it matched, this would blend in and you would hardly see these stitches at all. Make sure you pull each stitch flat without pulling it too tight. But if you leave too much wiggle room in this stitch, then this line will gape, and we do not want this to open or gape at all. If this were a pillow and it's filled with polyfill, we would not want that polyfill to come back out those holes. And do try your very best to keep your needle right on the crease of the fabric. Use that tunnel, just like that. Again, if I would want to end my stitch, I would take a small stitch, probably out of the fold. You can hide this knot a little bit better if it's not in the fold itself, but it's right next to where you're ending. And then take that small stitch, wrap in the loop, and pull until it's flat. That's the slip stitch.